The day his wife leaned over the kitchen island smiling softly and guiding his hand toward the signature line, she believed she was about to steal his entire empire with one quiet stroke of a pen, but what she did not know was that the billionaire behind the dark glasses could see every single word on the page, and he had been waiting for this exact betrayal. That morning in their glass-walled mansion overlooking the woods, the sunlight poured through the tall windows like a spotlight, and Aaliyah Mercer leaned against the marble island in a silky navy blouse, looking calm and sweet and patient like a woman helping her husband through a hard season. And Elijah stood there in dark shades with a white cane in his left hand, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw set, his expression blank and unreadable, acting like the world had gone dark for him 3 months ago. But behind those lenses his eyes were sharp. Sharp enough to read every word on the paper she slid in front of him. Sharp enough to see the faint tremble in her fingers as she tapped the signature line. Sharp enough to notice the brown leather folder sitting beside her coffee cup like it had been prepared the night before. And sharp enough to understand that the woman he built an empire with was about to try to steal it from him using his own hand. Aaliyah spoke softly like she was comforting a child, and she said, "Baby, this is important for the company. The attorneys need your signature today. It is just routine paperwork, nothing you have to stress about." Elijah nodded slowly like he was trusting her completely, and he let his cane rest against his thigh as if he needed it to stand. Then he reached out with his right hand, found the pen she placed between his fingers, and lowered his head toward the page like a man trying to feel his way through darkness. And while he acted confused and helpless, his mind was moving faster than any boardroom negotiation he had ever dominated. Because Elijah Mercer was not just a billionaire. He was the kind of billionaire who could smell greed the way a shark smells blood. And Aaliyah was bleeding ambition all over that marble countertop. He dragged the pen tip along the paper slowly, pretending he could not find the line, and Aaliyah leaned closer with that same smile, guiding his wrist like she was helping him sign a birthday card. She said, "Right there, baby, just sign right there, and then we can finally get back to focusing on your recovery." Elijah let out a quiet breath like he was tired, and he signed. Not his full signature. Not the signature that built contracts and closed acquisitions and made men in suits sweat. He signed a sloppy version of his name, one he had practiced in private, a signature designed to look like a blind man trying his best. And as soon as the ink touched the page, Aaliyah's smile grew wider, and she slid the paper away like it was gold. She kissed his cheek with a softness that would have fooled the whole world, and she whispered, "I am proud of you." Then she picked up the folder and walked away with it like she had just collected the deed to heaven. Elijah stood there still, holding his cane, listening to the click of her heels fading down the hall, and the moment she disappeared, his face changed. The blank helpless expression melted away, and what was left was a man with a storm behind his eyes. He turned his head slightly, not toward the hallway, but toward the ceiling corner where a small black lens blended into the architecture. A security camera. One of many. And Elijah's voice came out low and calm, like he was talking to himself, but he was not. He said, "Record everything." Then he smiled. Not a happy smile. A dangerous one. Because the truth was Elijah Mercer had been waiting for this moment. Not because he wanted to be betrayed. But because he needed proof. And proof was the only thing that could destroy someone like Aaliyah Mercer without destroying the empire with her. 3 months earlier, the whole country had watched the headlines explode. Billionaire Elijah Mercer goes blind after mysterious accident. The news played the footage on repeat, showing Elijah leaving the hospital in dark shades, surrounded by security, holding a cane like a man who had lost the sun. People cried for him online, people prayed, people speculated, and the business world shook because Elijah Mercer was not just rich. He was a legend. A self-made black billionaire who came from nothing, built Mercer Holdings into a multi-industry giant, and made Wall Street respect him the way they respect storms and earthquakes. And now he was blind. Or at least that was what the world believed. What nobody knew was that the accident was not mysterious to Elijah at all. It was intentional. And it was the moment he realized the people closest to him were not just waiting for him to fall. They were pushing him. The accident happened on a rainy night after a charity gala. Elijah and Aaliyah had been in the back seat of their armored car, laughing about a joke one of the senators told, and Elijah had been relaxed for the first time in weeks. Because for months he had been feeling something cold in his marriage. Not hate. Not anger. Something worse. Calculation. Aaliyah had been looking at him like he was an asset, not a husband. Like he was a portfolio, not a person. And that night when they reached a sharp curve on the private road leading to their estate, the car suddenly swerved hard, smashed through the guardrail, and rolled into the trees. The driver claimed the brakes failed. The security team claimed it was an accident. The police called it unfortunate. But Elijah remembered something the others did not. He remembered Aaliyah's hand on the back of his seat right before the impact, like she was bracing herself. He remembered the strange smell in the air, like something chemical. He remembered the way the driver's eyes looked in the rearview mirror, wide and terrified like he was being controlled. And he remembered waking up in the hospital with his vision blurry, doctors talking, Aaliyah crying, cameras flashing. Then the doctor said the words that changed everything. He said, "You have severe optic nerve trauma, your sight may never return." Aaliyah collapsed into his arms like she was devastated, and she whispered, "Baby, I am here, I am not going anywhere." But Elijah felt it. Under the tears, under the trembling, under the performance. He felt relief. He felt the weight of a woman who had been waiting for this. And that was when Elijah made the decision that saved his life. He decided to pretend. Because Elijah Mercer had spent his whole life learning one rule. The moment people think you are weak, they reveal what they really are. So he leaned into the blindness like it was real. He wore the shades. He carried the cane. He moved slower. He asked for help. He stopped attending board meetings. He let Aaliyah speak for him in public. He let the executives whisper behind his back. He let the media pity him. And while the world watched the billionaire fall, Elijah watched the world. Because he was not blind. Not anymore. The doctors were right about one thing. The trauma was real. For the first 2 weeks, Elijah could barely see shapes. But then his vision began to return slowly, like a sunrise. He kept it secret. He told nobody. Not his lawyers. Not his security chief. Not even his mother. Because he did not know who to trust. And the more he stayed silent, the more the truth revealed itself. Aaliyah started making moves. Small moves at first. She changed the passwords to certain accounts, claiming she was helping him manage things. She requested power of attorney documents, claiming the attorneys needed them for protection. She began meeting with executives without him, claiming it was for the company's stability. And Elijah listened from the shadows like a ghost haunting his own life. One night he heard her on the phone in the upstairs office. He stood outside the door, cane in hand, acting like he was lost in the hallway, and he listened as she whispered to someone. She said, "Once I get the properties transferred, he will be done, and nobody will question it because everyone thinks he is blind and broken." Then she laughed. A low laugh that made Elijah's blood turn cold. And she said, "He built all this, but I am the one who deserves to own it." That night Elijah went downstairs to the security room where the monitors glowed in the dark like a city of eyes. The head of security, a former Marine named Dante Cross, was sitting there sipping coffee. Dante stood up fast when he saw Elijah. He said, "Mr. Mercer, do you need anything, are you lost?" Elijah tilted his head, acting confused. He said, "I heard a noise, I was just walking." Dante offered to escort him back, but Elijah shook his head slowly. Then Elijah said quietly, "Dante, how long have you been with me?" Dante paused. He said, 7 years, sir." Elijah nodded. He said, "And in 7 years, have you ever seen me lose?" Dante swallowed. He said, "No, sir." Elijah leaned in. He said, "Then do not let me lose now." Dante's eyes narrowed. He said, "Sir." Elijah lifted his shades just enough for Dante to see the truth. Not fully. Just enough. And Dante's face changed instantly, like he had seen a ghost come back to life. Elijah said, I can see, and I need you to keep it that way, and I need every camera in this house recording every breath my wife takes. Dante stared for a long second. Then he nodded. He said, yes, sir. From that moment, Elijah began building his counterattack. Quietly. Patiently. Like a man setting traps in the dark. He installed hidden cameras in the kitchen, the office, the hallway, even the guest room where Aaliyah sometimes took private calls. He had Dante clone Aaliyah's phone data so he could see who she was talking to. He had his private investigator follow the executives who suddenly became loyal to her. And the deeper he looked, the uglier the truth became. Aaliyah was not just planning to steal his property. She was planning to erase him. Because the documents she slid in front of him that morning were not simple company paperwork. They were property transfer agreements. They were deeds. They were legal ownership shifts for multiple Mercer estates, private islands, commercial buildings, and a majority stake in Mercer Holdings itself. And the craziest part was how confident she was. She believed Elijah was helpless. She believed his blindness made him powerless. She believed the world would accept whatever story she told. And that belief was her biggest mistake. That same afternoon, Aaliyah left the house with the folder, dressed in a cream coat and heels, moving like a queen walking to her coronation. Elijah waited until her car disappeared down the driveway. Then he walked to the kitchen island without the cane. Without hesitation. Without the slow, careful steps. He moved like himself again, tall and controlled, and he picked up the second copy of the documents she left behind by accident. Because Aaliyah was too excited to be careful. He read every page. Every line. Every signature box. Every legal description of land and property. And when he reached the last page, he saw something that made him laugh out loud. Not because it was funny. Because it was insulting. The final clause stated that the transfers were voluntary and made under sound mind, and it included a medical attachment claiming Elijah Mercer was visually impaired and mentally vulnerable due to trauma. Aaliyah had prepared a whole narrative. She was not just stealing. She was building a legal coffin. Elijah placed the papers down gently. Then he walked to the window and stared outside at the woods, the same woods where their car had crashed. His mind flashed back to the moment they first met. Aaliyah was not always this. She had been brilliant, hungry, loyal. They met when Elijah was still fighting to become a millionaire, when Mercer Holdings was just a small tech consulting firm operating out of a rented office. Aaliyah had been a corporate attorney then, sharp and fearless, and she had believed in him before anyone else did. She helped him close his first major deal. She stood beside him when banks refused him. She defended him in rooms full of people who underestimated him because he was black. And Elijah loved her for that. He married her because he thought she was his equal. His partner. His ride or die. But somewhere along the way, love became entitlement. Partnership became possession. And Aaliyah started seeing Elijah's empire as something she deserved even without him. And now she was willing to fake his weakness, manipulate his signature, and strip him down to nothing. Elijah turned away from the window and walked upstairs to his private study. He opened a hidden safe behind a painting and pulled out a small black notebook. Inside were names. Dates. Numbers. Every person in his company who owed him loyalty. Every person who owed him money. Every person who had betrayed him before. Because Elijah Mercer did not become a billionaire by trusting people blindly. He became a billionaire by remembering everything. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote one name at the top. Aaliyah Mercer. Then he wrote a second name underneath. Dr. Howard Raines. The physician who signed the medical attachment. Then a third name. Gerald Pike. The lawyer who drafted the documents. Then a fourth. Victor Sloan. The executive who had been whispering in Aaliyah's ear for weeks. Elijah stared at the list. Then he smiled again. Because this was bigger than a marriage. This was a coup. And Elijah was about to turn it into a public execution. Not with violence. Not with rage. With strategy. Because the best revenge for a man like Elijah Mercer was not to destroy someone in private. It was to destroy them in front of the world, with receipts, with proof, with truth so clean and sharp nobody could defend them. That evening Aaliyah returned home late, acting tired and stressed like she had spent the day fighting for the company. She kissed Elijah on the forehead, placed his dinner plate in front of him, and spoke in that sweet voice again. She said, "Baby, the attorneys said everything is handled, all we need now is for you to rest, and tomorrow we will finally start rebuilding." Elijah nodded slowly, pretending to eat. He said, "Thank you." Aaliyah smiled. She said, "You are welcome, I am always going to protect you." Elijah lowered his head. He said, "I know." But inside his mind, he was counting down. Because he knew what was coming next. Aaliyah was going to take those signed documents to the courthouse and file them. She was going to move money. She was going to start transferring ownership. And once it was done, she was going to tell the world Elijah Mercer was too blind and too broken to fight back. Then she was going to push him out of his own empire like he was nothing. But she did not know Elijah Mercer was watching every step. And she did not know Elijah Mercer had already begun writing the story of her downfall. Later that night, when Aaliyah went upstairs to shower, Elijah sat alone in the dark living room. The only light came from the city glow outside and the soft reflection of the kitchen marble. Dante Cross appeared quietly from the hallway like a shadow. He said, "Mr. Mercer, we got the footage from the kitchen, and we got her phone logs from today." Elijah looked up. He said, "Who did she call?" Dante hesitated. He said she called Victor Sloan 3 times, and she called Gerald Pike twice, and she called an unknown number that traced to a burner phone. Elijah's eyes narrowed. He said, "And the documents?" Dante said she went to Pike and Associates, then she went to the county records office, and she filed them. Elijah leaned back slowly, letting the information settle like a cold drink. So it had begun. The theft was official. The betrayal was on paper. Elijah said quietly, "Good." Dante looked confused. He said, "Good, sir." Elijah stood up, and for the first time in months he removed his shades completely. His eyes were clear and bright in the dark. He said, "Yes, because now she thinks she has already won, and that is when people make their biggest mistakes." Dante swallowed. He said, "What do you want me to do?" Elijah walked toward the staircase. He said, "Prepare the boardroom, call my attorneys, and tomorrow morning I want every executive who has been kissing her ring to be sitting at that table." Dante nodded. He said, "Yes, sir." Elijah paused at the bottom step. Then he turned back toward the kitchen where the papers had been signed. He stared at the marble island like it was a battlefield. Then he said softly, almost like a prayer. He said, "She wanted me to sign my own empire away, so I will sign something too." Dante said, "What, sir?" Elijah smiled. He said, "Her future." And he walked upstairs, leaving the darkness behind him like a man returning to his throne. And upstairs, Aaliyah Mercer was humming in the shower, smiling to herself, thinking she had just stolen the world from a blind man. Not knowing the blind man had been watching her the whole time. Not knowing the next morning would be the day her name became a warning to every person who ever tried to play Elijah Mercer. Not knowing she had just signed the beginning of her own end. By sunrise the next morning, Aaliyah Mercer was already dressed like a woman stepping into her victory speech, and she moved through the mansion with a soft confidence that made the house feel like it belonged to her alone. She wore a cream-colored pantsuit that hugged her waist perfectly, her hair laid smooth and shining, her perfume light but expensive, and when she walked into the kitchen she did not look like a wife caring for a blind husband. She looked like a CEO preparing to replace one. Elijah sat at the marble island in his dark shades, cane resting against his leg, posture calm and still, acting like he was listening to the sound of her footsteps for direction. But in reality he was watching every detail. The way she glanced at the leather folder on the counter as if checking whether it was still there. The way her eyes flickered toward his hands as if remembering how easily she guided them. The way she smiled at him like a person smiling at a locked safe after finally finding the combination. She poured herself coffee and spoke sweetly, and she said, "Baby, today is going to be busy. I have a meeting downtown with the attorneys and then I have to stop by Mercer Holdings to make sure the board is aligned." Elijah nodded slowly like he understood nothing, and he said okay. Aaliyah leaned in and kissed his forehead, and her lips lingered half a second longer than usual like she was sealing the deal. Then she whispered, "I love you." Elijah's mouth curved into a faint smile. He said, "I love you too." And that was the moment Aaliyah fully relaxed. Because she believed the blind man had no idea he had just signed away half his world. She picked up her purse, grabbed her folder, and headed for the door. But before she left, she paused and turned back, her voice suddenly softer, almost pitying. She said, "Baby, I know this is hard for you, but I promise you, I am going to take care of everything." Elijah tilted his head slightly. He said, "I know you will." Aaliyah smiled again, then she walked out. The front door closed. The sound echoed through the mansion like the final click of a trap being locked. Elijah sat still for 3 long seconds. Then he stood up. And the moment he stood, he did not reach for his cane. He did not move slowly. He did not act confused. He walked with the same steady power he always had, like the man who built the empire, not the man who lost it. He went straight to the living room, where a hidden panel in the wall opened with a fingerprint scan. Inside was a private communications setup, a secure line connected to his legal team, his security chief, and his personal financial strategist. Dante Cross was already waiting there with 2 tablets in his hands. Dante said, "Good morning, Mr. Mercer." Elijah said, "Good morning, tell me everything." Dante handed him the first tablet. On the screen was footage from the kitchen the day before, crystal clear, showing Aaliyah guiding Elijah's hand as he signed. The second tablet displayed a list of phone calls, messages, and a transcript from a recorded conversation Aaliyah had with Victor Sloan the night before. Dante said, "She is moving fast, sir. She filed the property transfers yesterday, and her lawyer Pike has already started the process to move assets into a new trust under her name." Elijah's jaw tightened. He said, "How much?" Dante said, "If she gets everything through, she will control almost 40% of your real estate portfolio and 20% of Mercer Holdings voting shares." Elijah let out a slow breath. He said, "And the board?" Dante said, "They are split, some are loyal to you, some are loyal to her, and some are just loyal to whoever looks like they will win." Elijah nodded. He said, "Typical." Then Elijah tapped the screen where Victor Sloan's name appeared again. He said, "What do we know about Sloan?" Dante hesitated. He said he has been meeting with Mrs. Mercer privately for months, and he has a history of embezzlement allegations from his previous company, but it was settled quietly. Elijah's eyes narrowed. He said, "So he is the kind of man who sells his soul for stock options?" Dante said, "Yes, sir." Elijah leaned back in the chair. He said, "And Pike?" Dante said, "Pike is aggressive, he is known for divorces and asset transfers, and he has connections at the courthouse." Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. He said, "And the doctor?" Dante said, "Dr. Howard Raines signed the medical attachment claiming you are mentally vulnerable, but we pulled his financial records, and last month he received a payment from a shell company linked to Victor Sloan." Elijah stared at Dante. Then he laughed softly, not amused, but impressed by how dirty they were willing to play. He said, "So they tried to build a legal story that I am blind and incompetent, so she can steal everything without a fight." Dante nodded. Elijah stood up. He said, "Then we are going to rewrite the story." Dante said, "How, sir?" Elijah walked toward the window, looking out at the driveway where Aaliyah's car had been moments earlier. He said, "We are going to let her think she is winning, and then we are going to take everything from her in one day." Dante said, "What do you need from me?" Elijah turned back. He said call the board, schedule an emergency meeting at Mercer Holdings for noon, and tell them I will be attending. Dante blinked. He said sir, the world thinks you are blind, if you show up. Elijah smiled. He said exactly. Dante understood instantly, and his eyes widened. He said you want to reveal it. Elijah said not yet, but I want them to feel the fear first. Dante nodded. He said yes sir. Elijah picked up his phone and dialed a secure number. The line rang once, then a calm voice answered. Mr. Mercer. Elijah said Veronica, I need you. Veronica Langley was his lead attorney, a black woman with a reputation for destroying people in court without raising her voice. She had represented Elijah in acquisitions, hostile takeovers, and lawsuits that could have collapsed Mercer Holdings. She was loyal to Elijah because he respected her mind, and because she had watched him build his empire from scratch. Veronica said I heard rumors, sir, people are saying Mrs. Mercer is moving assets. Elijah said it is not a rumor, it is happening, and I have proof. Veronica paused. She said do you want to file an injunction? Elijah said not yet. Veronica said not yet. Elijah said I want to catch everyone involved, I want the board to see it, I want the courts to see it, and I want the world to see it, because if we do this quietly, she will spin a story that I am a bitter husband trying to control his wife. Veronica said and if we do it publicly. Elijah said then she becomes a thief on camera, and no one can defend her. Veronica was silent for a moment. Then she said you have a plan. Elijah said yes, and I want you in the room at noon, bring every document, every legal weapon, and every clause you can find. Veronica said I will be there. Elijah ended the call. Then he made another. This one to his private banker. Then another to his head of corporate finance. Then another to a man he trusted more than anyone outside his bloodline. His older brother, Marcus Mercer. Marcus answered with a tired voice. He said Elijah, I was wondering when you would call. Elijah said you already know. Marcus said I know your wife is trying to rob you, and I know you are not blind, because you are too stubborn to stay blind. Elijah smiled. He said I need you today. Marcus said tell me what to do. Elijah said come to Mercer Holdings at noon, and bring the shareholder proxy list, I want every voting percentage in your hand. Marcus said done. Elijah ended the call and stared at the kitchen again. He could almost see the moment Aaliyah guided his hand like a puppet. He could almost hear her voice saying just sign right there baby. And he could almost feel the betrayal burning under his skin. But Elijah did not let anger lead him. He let strategy lead him. Because anger makes you rush. Strategy makes you win. At 10:30, Elijah walked into his private wardrobe and changed into a sharp charcoal suit. He adjusted his cufflinks, straightened his tie, and placed his shades back on his face. Then he picked up his cane again. Not because he needed it. But because the world needed to believe he did. Dante's security team escorted him to the armored car, and as they drove toward the city, Elijah watched the skyline through the tinted window. The buildings he owned. The companies he controlled. The streets his name was written on. He thought about how hard he fought to get here. He thought about how many people doubted him. He thought about the nights he slept in his office, the deals he lost, the deals he won, the sacrifices he made. And he thought about the woman beside him for most of it. Aaliyah. The same woman now trying to strip him down like he was nothing. Elijah's hands clenched into fists, then relaxed again. Because the pain was real. But the lesson was bigger. The lesson was that love does not protect you from greed. Sometimes love invites greed closer. At 11:50, the car pulled up to Mercer Holdings. The building was a massive glass tower with the Mercer logo shining at the top like a crown. As soon as Elijah stepped out, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Mr. Mercer, is it true you have been out of the company for months? Mr. Mercer, are you really blind? Mr. Mercer, is your wife running the company now? Elijah did not answer. He walked slowly, cane tapping the pavement, head held high. And the sight of him made people freeze. Because even blind, Elijah Mercer carried power like a storm cloud. Security escorted him inside, through the lobby, into the private elevator. The doors closed. And in the quiet, Dante leaned toward him. Dante said, "Sir, the board is already panicking." Elijah said, "Good." Dante said, "Mrs. Mercer is in the building." Elijah's mouth tightened. He said, "She will be." The elevator opened to the executive floor, and Elijah stepped out. The hallway was lined with framed magazine covers featuring Elijah and Aaliyah as the power couple of corporate America. Black billionaire and his queen. The Mercers take over tech. The most influential black family in business. Elijah walked past them, feeling like he was walking past ghosts. Then he reached the boardroom doors. Inside, 12 executives sat around the long table, their faces tense. Victor Sloan was there, sitting near the head of the table like he belonged there. Aaliyah was there too, dressed perfectly, her posture confident, her smile already prepared. And when she saw Elijah enter with his cane and shades, her eyes lit up with something dangerous. Not love. Not relief. Victory. She stood up quickly, pretending to be surprised. She said, "Elijah, what are you doing here, baby? You should be resting." Elijah walked toward the head of the table slowly. He said, "I wanted to see my company." Aaliyah smiled, her voice dripping with fake concern. She said, "Of course, but this meeting is complicated, and I do not want you stressed, we can talk later." Elijah turned his head toward her, voice like he was searching for her in darkness. He said, "Aaliyah, I trust you, but I still want to listen." Victor Sloan leaned forward, smiling. He said, "Mr. Mercer, we are honored you could join us, we were just discussing the future of Mercer Holdings given your condition." Elijah tilted his head. He said, "My condition?" Victor said, "Yes, sir, the board needs stability, and Mrs. Mercer has been stepping up in a remarkable way, she has been acting as CEO in your absence." Elijah nodded slowly. He said, "And you approve?" Victor smiled. He said, "We all do." Elijah's mouth curved into a faint smile. He said, "Good." Then Elijah sat down at the head of the table. Aaliyah hesitated for a split second, because that seat was supposed to be hers now. But she recovered quickly and sat beside him like a loyal wife. Veronica Langley entered the room quietly and took a seat near the end of the table. Marcus Mercer entered too, holding a folder thick with shareholder documents. Aaliyah's eyes narrowed slightly when she saw Marcus. She did not like Marcus because Marcus saw through her. Elijah folded his hands on the table. He said, "I heard there were documents signed yesterday." Aaliyah's heart skipped, but she kept her face smooth. She said, "Yes, baby, just routine legal protections for the company, you signed them, remember?" Elijah nodded slowly. He said, "I remember." Victor leaned in. He said, "Those documents ensure Mercer Holdings can continue operating smoothly while you recover." Elijah said, "That sounds good." Then he paused. And the room grew quiet. Because Elijah's voice changed slightly. It became colder. Sharper. He said, "But I wonder why routine company documents included the deed to my private island in the Bahamas." Aaliyah froze. Victor blinked. The executives shifted in their seats. Aaliyah laughed lightly, too lightly, trying to make it sound like a misunderstanding. She said, "Elijah, baby, you are confused, those were not deeds, those were corporate asset allocations." Elijah nodded slowly. He said, "And I wonder why corporate asset allocations included my mother's home in Atlanta." Aaliyah's smile began to crack. Victor's eyes widened. One executive coughed nervously. Aaliyah said, "Elijah, you are tired, you do not understand legal language right now, please let us handle this." Elijah leaned forward. He said, "I also wonder why those documents included a medical attachment claiming I am mentally vulnerable." The room went dead silent. Aaliyah's face turned pale under her makeup. Victor tried to speak. He said, Mr. Mercer, these are standard protections. Elijah said standard. Then Elijah turned his head slightly toward Veronica. He said, Veronica, would you like to explain to the board what those documents actually were? Veronica stood up calmly. She placed a thick folder on the table. She said, ladies and gentlemen, yesterday Mrs. Mercer filed property transfer documents, deeds, and trust ownership changes that would move significant Mercer assets into her personal control, and she did so using Mr. Mercer's signature obtained under false pretenses. Aaliyah snapped. She said, that is a lie. Veronica did not flinch. She said, we have video evidence from the Mercer estate showing Mrs. Mercer presenting the documents as routine company paperwork, and we have recorded calls showing coordination with Victor Sloan and attorney Gerald Pike. Victor's face turned red. He said, this is outrageous. Elijah sat back, calm, still wearing his shades, still holding his cane like a blind man. And that was the most terrifying part. Because he looked powerless. But he was controlling the room like a puppet master. Aaliyah leaned close to Elijah, her voice low, desperate. She said, baby, why are you doing this? We can talk privately. Elijah turned toward her, and for the first time, his voice carried something that sounded like heartbreak. He said, privately. Aaliyah's eyes glistened. She said, yes. Elijah said, you tried to steal from me privately. Aaliyah's breath caught. The executives stared at her now, their loyalty shifting like sand. Victor stood up, furious. He said, Mr. Mercer, you are accusing your wife in front of the board, this is inappropriate. Elijah tilted his head. He said, is it inappropriate to steal? Victor slammed his hand on the table. He said, we are talking about governance, you are unfit to run this company right now. Elijah smiled. He said, unfit. Victor said, yes, you are blind, you are vulnerable, you are not stable. Elijah slowly lifted his shades. And the moment his eyes were revealed, clear and sharp and fully seeing, the entire room froze like time stopped. Aaliyah's mouth fell open. Victor's face drained of color. The executives stared like they had just witnessed a resurrection. Elijah looked around the table, making direct eye contact with each person one by one. Then he said quietly, I am not blind. The room erupted into chaos. One executive whispered, Jesus. Another said, what the hell? Aaliyah stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. She said, Elijah, what is this, what are you doing? Elijah's eyes stayed on her. He said, I was waiting for you to show me who you really are. Aaliyah's voice cracked. She said, I did this for us. Elijah laughed softly. He said, for us. Then he turned toward the board. He said, she tried to steal my empire, and some of you helped her, and some of you stayed silent, and some of you were ready to replace me the moment you thought I was weak. He paused. Then he said, today you will all choose where you stand. Marcus Mercer stepped forward and placed the shareholder proxy list on the table. Marcus said, Elijah still controls the majority voting shares, and any attempt to remove him will fail. Victor stared at Marcus. He said, you planned this. Marcus said, no, Victor, you planned this, we just caught you. Aaliyah's breathing became frantic. She said, Elijah, please, baby, listen to me, I love you. Elijah's voice became low. He said, you love what I built, and you love what my name gives you, but you do not love me. Aaliyah's eyes filled with tears. But Elijah did not soften. Because he had seen her smile when she thought she won. He had seen the relief in her face when the accident happened. He had heard her laugh on the phone about erasing him. And now the room was watching her crumble. Elijah turned toward Veronica. He said, file the injunction now. Veronica nodded. She said, already prepared. Elijah turned back toward Aaliyah. He said, the property transfers you filed yesterday will be frozen within the hour. Aaliyah shook her head. She said, no, you cannot do this, you cannot embarrass me like this. Elijah said, you embarrassed yourself the moment you tried to rob a man while he was pretending to be blind. Victor Sloan stepped back, sweating. He said, "Mr. Mercer, we can negotiate." Elijah's eyes locked onto him. He said, "You will negotiate with the federal investigators." Victor's mouth opened. He said, "What?" Elijah said, "Dante." Dante Cross opened the boardroom doors. Two men in dark suits stepped in, badges visible. FBI. The room went silent again. Because Elijah Mercer did not just bring lawyers. He brought consequences. The lead agent stepped forward. He said, "Victor Sloan, Gerald Pike, and Dr. Howard Raines are under investigation for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft of corporate assets." Victor's knees almost buckled. Aaliyah turned toward Elijah, her face twisted in disbelief. She whispered, "You called the FBI." Elijah said no. He leaned in. He said, "You did." Aaliyah stared at him like she did not recognize him. Elijah stood up slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. He said, "I gave you a chance to be my wife, and you chose to be my enemy." Aaliyah's tears fell. She said, "I did not mean to hurt you." Elijah said, "You did not care if you hurt me, you only cared if you got caught." The FBI agents moved toward Victor first, placing him in cuffs. Victor shouted, panicking. He said, "Aaliyah, tell them this was your idea." Aaliyah's head snapped toward him. Her eyes widened. And in that moment, Elijah saw the truth clearly. Victor was not her partner. He was her tool. And now he was turning on her. Aaliyah stepped back, shaking. She said, "Shut up." Victor screamed again. He said, "You said he was blind, you said he was done, you said you wanted him out." The board members looked at Aaliyah like she was poison. Elijah watched her face. And he felt something heavy. Not pity. Not anger. A deep disappointment. Because he realized the woman he loved was gone. Or maybe she never existed the way he believed. The FBI agent turned toward Aaliyah. He said, "Mrs. Mercer, we will need you to come with us as well." Aaliyah's breath caught. She said, "For what?" The agent said, "Attempted fraud and conspiracy." Aaliyah turned to Elijah, desperate now, her voice breaking. She said, "Elijah, please, please, do not let them take me, I am your wife." Elijah stared at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You stopped being my wife the moment you put those papers in front of me." Aaliyah reached for him, but Dante stepped between them. The agents escorted her toward the door. And as she passed Elijah, she whispered something that sounded like a curse. She said, "You think you won." Elijah leaned close enough for only her to hear. He said, "I did not win, Aaliyah, I survived." Then she was gone. The boardroom sat in stunned silence. The executive stared at Elijah like he was a man who just came back from the dead and dragged the devil out with him. Elijah looked around the table. He said, "This meeting is not over." He paused. Then he said, "Now we are going to talk about everyone in this room who knew what she was doing and stayed quiet." And the fear that spread across those faces was the real beginning of the story. Because Aaliyah's betrayal was only the first layer. And Elijah Mercer was about to expose every snake hiding inside his empire. Elijah Mercer stood at the head of the boardroom table with his shades off and his eyes fully visible, and the silence in that room felt heavier than any lawsuit because every executive understood the same terrifying truth: the man they thought was finished was not only alive and seeing, he was taking inventory of every betrayal with the calm precision of a surgeon. The Mercer Holdings boardroom was all glass and steel and polished wood, but fear has its own texture, and in that moment fear coated every surface, in the tight throats, in the sweaty palms, in the forced smiles that could not hide the panic behind them. Marcus Mercer remained beside his brother like a wall, holding the shareholder proxy list and watching the table like he was looking for movement from enemies, while Veronica Langley sat with her folder open, already prepared to carve through any lie that tried to stand up. Dante Cross waited near the door, arms folded, eyes locked forward, not as security but as a reminder that Elijah Mercer's authority was not a rumor, it had muscle, cameras, receipts, and consequences. Elijah did not raise his voice, he did not slam his fist, he did not perform anger for them, because he did not need to. The power in his calmness was what made grown executives feel like children caught stealing. He slowly walked along the side of the table, making eye contact with each board member, and the way their gazes dropped told him everything he needed to know about where their loyalty really lived. Some of them looked ashamed, some looked annoyed like they were angry they got caught, some looked calculating like they were already trying to figure out how to survive the new reality, and those were the ones Elijah wanted most, because a coward can be managed, but a calculator will always betray again. Elijah stopped behind a woman named Cynthia Reeves, the chief operating officer who had been with Mercer Holdings for 10 years, a black woman with sharp suits and sharper instincts, someone Elijah once trusted like family. Cynthia's hands were clasped together in front of her, but her thumbs kept rubbing each other, a small nervous habit Elijah recognized, because he had watched her do it years ago when she lied to a vendor about a delayed payment. Elijah spoke her name softly, Cynthia. Cynthia flinched like his voice had a blade hidden inside it, and she looked up, her eyes trying to appear steady. Elijah. Elijah said you were in my office last month with Aaliyah, and you told me the company needed a new asset protection plan to stabilize investor confidence. Do you remember that conversation? Cynthia swallowed, and she nodded. Yes, I remember. Elijah said you told me it was standard, you told me my signature was needed on future documents for that plan, and you told me not to worry because Aaliyah was handling it. Do you remember that too? Cynthia's lips parted, then closed again, like she was searching for the safest words. Yes, I do. Elijah leaned slightly closer, his voice still quiet, and he asked, did you know those documents were deeds and transfers? Cynthia's eyes flickered toward the table like she wanted help from someone, and no one moved, because fear is selfish, and when the king returns, everyone protects their own neck first. Cynthia said, Elijah, I did not know the details, I was told it was restructuring for your protection, and for the company's protection. Elijah nodded slowly like he accepted the sentence, but not the meaning, and he said you did not know the details, but you knew she was moving fast, you knew she was meeting attorneys without me, you knew she was asking for medical attachments, and you knew she was pushing a narrative that I was not stable, and you still sat in meetings nodding, telling people we should support Aaliyah for the sake of stability. Cynthia's face tightened, because that part was undeniable, and she whispered I was trying to keep the company from collapsing. Elijah's eyes remained locked on hers, and he said the company does not collapse when its leader is injured, it collapses when the people around him decide they can replace him, and you were not protecting Mercer Holdings, you were protecting your seat. Cynthia's eyes shimmered with emotion, but Elijah did not soften, because he could not afford softness right now, not with snakes still coiled inside his house. He moved on, stopping behind a man named Thomas Granger, the chief financial officer, a black man with a calm face and a history of playing both sides in every negotiation. Thomas tried to smile like this was all business. Elijah, you look well, it is good to see you in person. Elijah said it is good to be seen, Thomas, especially after I watched you approve an internal transfer request that rerouted building revenues from 3 Mercer commercial properties into a temporary holding account connected to a trust one did not authorize. Thomas's smile froze, and he blinked slowly like he was buying time. That request was part of a contingency plan. We were advised to prepare cash flow in case your condition required a prolonged absence. Elijah nodded, and he said advised by who? Thomas hesitated, then said by Victor Sloan and Mrs. Mercer. Elijah said, and did it not occur to you that Victor Sloan had no authority to advise you on my assets, and that my wife was asking you to move money while telling the world I could not see, and that maybe it would be wise to call me directly? Thomas's throat moved as he swallowed. Elijah, you were recovering, and the doctors said you needed peace. Elijah said the doctors said that, or Aaliyah said that. Thomas looked down, and his silence answered everything. Elijah straightened and walked back toward the head of the table, then he turned to face all of them at once, his voice still controlled, still quiet, but now it carried the weight of a verdict. He said, I am going to say this one time, Mercer Holdings is not a charity, it is not a playground, and it is not a place where you gamble with my legacy because you think my eyes stopped working. He let the word sit, and the room stayed silent, because nobody wanted to be the next name. Elijah continued, and he said I built this company from a laptop and a rented room, I fought through rooms where men smiled in my face and tried to drown me in paperwork behind my back, I survived banks that said no, investors that laughed, competitors that tried to buy me, and politicians that tried to control me, and I did all of that without losing my soul." He paused, then said, "So understand me clearly, if you tried to take advantage of me, if you helped my wife file fraudulent transfers, if you moved funds without authorization, if you signed off on narrative building to label me incompetent, then you are not an employee, you are an accomplice." One board member finally spoke, a man named Harold Vance, the oldest person in the room, a senior advisor who had been with Elijah since the early days, and his voice came out shaky but honest. He said, "Elijah, what do you want from us now?" Elijah looked at Harold, and something in his eyes softened just slightly, because Harold's fear was not guilt, it was concern. Elijah said, "I want the truth, and I want it clean, because if I have to dig it out myself, the consequences will be heavier." Veronica Langley stood up and slid a single page across the table, and her voice was calm and sharp like a blade wrapped in velvet. She said, "This is a written declaration, each of you will sign it before you leave, stating whether you had knowledge of Mrs. Mercer's actions, whether you assisted, whether you benefited, and whether you were pressured by Victor Sloan or anyone else." She looked around the room, and she added, "If you lie on that declaration, you will be lying to attorneys and investigators, and you will not enjoy what happens next." The executive stared at the page like it was radioactive. Elijah watched their faces, because a written declaration does not only trap liars legally, it exposes character in real time. The innocent sign quickly, the guilty hesitate, the opportunists look for loopholes. Cynthia signed with trembling hands. Thomas signed slower, like each letter hurt. Two board members exchanged glances before signing, and Elijah noted them both, because glances are conversations when fear is present. When the declarations were collected, Veronica whispered to Elijah that she would cross-reference every statement with the phone logs and camera footage, and Elijah nodded, because he was not interested in apologies, he was interested in accuracy. Then Elijah did something none of them expected. He said, "The board meeting is adjourned, but do not get comfortable, because by the end of today, Mercer Holdings will have a new structure, and not one of you will be unsure about where the power sits." The executive stood slowly, chairs scraping, and they filed out like people leaving a courtroom after a guilty verdict. Elijah stayed behind with Marcus, Veronica, and Dante, and the moment the door closed, Marcus exhaled like he had been holding his breath for an hour. Marcus said, "You just shook the whole building, little brother, you sure you ready for what comes next?" Elijah walked to the window and looked down at the city streets below, then he said, "I am ready, because Aaliyah is not done yet." Veronica stepped closer, and she said, "You think she will fight?" Elijah let out a slow breath, and he said, "She will not accept losing quietly. She did not just try to take property, she tried to erase me, and people like that do not switch back to being gentle when they get caught." Dante nodded, and he said, "My team is monitoring her movements. She was released on bond, and she has not gone home, she went straight to Pike's office." Marcus cursed under his breath, because he understood the implication. She was not running, she was strategizing. Elijah said, "Good, let her strategize, because I want her to walk deeper into the trap." Veronica said, "The injunction will freeze the transfers, but she will try to challenge it, and Pike will try to argue you signed voluntarily, they will try to paint you as deceptive for pretending to be blind." Elijah nodded, and he said, "Let them, because deception is not fraud, and pretending to be blind is not the same as tricking someone into stealing. The only reason I pretended was because I suspected betrayal, and now I have proof of betrayal." Veronica said, "We also have to consider public narrative, the media will explode when they learn you were not blind." Elijah said, "I want it to explode, because silence is how people like Aaliyah survive. She will try to frame herself as the wife who saved the company while her husband spiraled." Marcus said, "And you want to frame the truth first?" Elijah turned toward Marcus, and he said, "Not frame, reveal, because the truth is the sharpest weapon we have, and I have enough truth to cut through any story she tries to tell." Dante's phone buzzed, and he checked it, then his eyes lifted. He said, "Sir, she is on her way here." Elijah's jaw tightened slightly, then relaxed again. He said, "Of course she is." Marcus frowned, and he said, "She is coming back to the building after what happened." Elijah nodded, and he said she is coming to plead, threaten, bargain, or perform, and whichever one she chooses will determine how she falls. Veronica said, do you want security to block her? Elijah said, no, I want her to come in, I want her on camera, I want her words recorded, and I want her to realize the blind man she tried to play is the only person who can decide whether she gets destroyed publicly or quietly. Minutes later, the hallway outside the boardroom filled with movement, heels clicking fast, voices raised, security shifting into position, and then the door opened hard. Aaliyah Mercer walked in like a storm wrapped in designer fabric, her eyes red but fierce, her face tight with fury, and behind her stood Gerald Pike, her attorney, a man with slick hair and sharp eyes that measured everything like a transaction. Aaliyah pointed at Elijah the moment she saw him, and her voice came out loud, Elijah, what the hell is wrong with you? Elijah did not move, he did not react, he did not flinch, and that calm made her rage look even more unstable. She stepped closer, jabbing her finger in the air, you set me up, you lied to me, you pretended to be blind, you humiliated me in front of your board, you brought federal agents into my life, do you understand what you just did? Elijah's voice remained low, and he said, I understand exactly what I did, I revealed what you did. Aaliyah's chest rose and fell fast, and she said, I did nothing but protect our future, you have been paranoid, you have been controlling, you have been impossible since that accident, and I was trying to keep Mercer Holdings stable. Pike stepped forward smoothly, and he said, Mr. Mercer, my client is prepared to resolve this privately, you have already caused enough reputational damage, and it would be in everyone's best interest to handle the marital dispute without criminal escalation. Elijah looked at Pike like he was staring at a man trying to sell umbrellas in a hurricane. Elijah said, marital dispute, you mean attempted theft? Pike's smile tightened, and he said, your wife had every reason to believe she had authority to sign certain assets into trust arrangements, she is your spouse, she has acted as your proxy during your impairment, and you did sign the documents. Elijah nodded slowly, and he said, yes, I signed, because she told me they were company documents, and you drafted them so they looked clean, and you attached a medical claim saying I was mentally vulnerable, and you filed them fast, hoping I would be too blind and too confused to fight. Aaliyah snapped, and she said, stop acting like a victim, you were never blind, you are the one who lied. Elijah looked at her, and for a brief moment his voice carried pain, and he said, I lied to catch you, you lied to take from me. Aaliyah's eyes filled again, and she leaned toward him, lowering her voice like she was trying to hypnotize him the way she used to when they were in love. She said, baby, listen, we can fix this, we can go home, we can talk, we can make a statement, we can blame it on Victor, we can say he manipulated me, we can protect our name. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly, because she said our name, not your heart, not our marriage, not us as people, she said our name, because that was always her real love. Marcus stepped forward, and he said, Aaliyah, stop it, you got caught, and now you trying to rewrite the script like we are stupid. Aaliyah turned to Marcus with venom, and she said, stay out of my marriage. Marcus said, you made it everybody's business when you tried to rob my brother. Aaliyah turned back to Elijah, desperation flickering under her anger, and she said, Elijah, if you do not stop this, the media will tear us apart, investors will panic, the company will suffer, and you will be blamed too, because you tricked the world. Elijah nodded slowly, and he said, I accept whatever blame comes with telling the truth, because I would rather take a hit than let a lie become the foundation of my empire. Pike stepped in again, voice smooth, and he said, Mr. Mercer, I advise you to consider settlement terms, my client is willing to relinquish certain transfers in exchange for a clean separation agreement, and if you refuse, we will litigate, and we will make your deception the headline. Elijah smiled faintly, and he said, you can make it a headline, I am not afraid of headlines, I built this company under headlines that said I would fail, I survived them, and I will survive this. Aaliyah's face twisted, and she said, you think you are untouchable because you are rich. Elijah said, no, I am untouchable because I am prepared, and you are panicking because you are exposed. Dante shifted slightly near the door, and the small red light of the security camera in the corner blinked quietly, capturing every word, every expression, every threat, every plea. Elijah leaned forward, and his voice dropped lower, and he said, Aaliyah, I am going to give you a choice. Aaliyah blinked, and her anger paused, because she heard something final in his tone. Elijah said you can cooperate fully, you can sign a reversal agreement, you can surrender every claim, and you can provide a sworn statement about everyone involved, including Pike, including the doctor, including any executive you pressured, and if you do that, I will keep certain details out of the press. Pike's eyes sharpened, and he said, Mr. Mercer, that is coercion. Veronica stepped forward, and she said it is not coercion, it is an offer of confidentiality in exchange for cooperation, and you know that, Mr. Pike. Aaliyah's breathing quickened, and she said, and if I do not? Elijah's gaze stayed steady, and he said, if you do not, then I will release everything, the kitchen footage, the phone calls, the courthouse filings, the medical attachment, and your statement about wanting me out, and I will personally fund the legal effort to pursue every consequence available, civil and criminal, and you will spend years trying to wash your name while the world remembers you as the woman who tried to steal from a man she thought was blind. Aaliyah stared at him like she was seeing him for the first time, and in a way she was, because she had been living beside his power for years, but she had never been on the other side of it. Her lips trembled, and then she tried one more angle, softer, almost broken. She said, Elijah, I did not want to hurt you, I was scared, I thought you were slipping away, I thought if you lost control, everything would collapse, and I did not want to lose everything we built. Elijah's voice stayed calm, and he said, you were not scared of collapse, you were scared of losing control, because if you loved what we built, you would have stood beside me and protected it with me, you would not have tried to transfer it into your name while I sat at home pretending I could not see. Aaliyah's eyes closed for a second, and when they opened, the softness was gone again, replaced by bitterness. She said, you want war, Elijah, then fine, we will go to war. Pike nodded like he was satisfied, and he said, we will see you in court, and we will enjoy explaining to the public how the great Elijah Mercer staged a disability for personal gain. Elijah nodded once, and he said, do what you have to do. Aaliyah turned sharply and walked toward the door, then she stopped and looked back, her voice cold. She said, you think you can destroy me, but you forget something, Elijah. Elijah said, what? Aaliyah said, I know where the bodies are buried in your company, and if you push me, I will dig up everything. The room went still. Marcus's jaw tightened. Veronica's eyes narrowed, calculating. Dante's posture stiffened like he was ready for anything. Elijah stared at Aaliyah, and he realized this was the true turning point, because she had just threatened him on camera, and she did not even realize how much that helped him. Elijah spoke quietly, and he said, thank you for saying that out loud. Aaliyah's eyes flickered with confusion for half a second. Then she turned and left, Pike following behind her quickly, the door closing with a hard final sound. The moment they were gone, Veronica exhaled and looked at Elijah. She said that threat was valuable, it shows intent, it shows retaliation, and it gives us leverage. Elijah nodded slowly. He said, it also tells me she has been digging for months, and if she found anything, she will try to use it to bargain. Marcus said, do we have anything to worry about? Elijah looked back out the window again, and he said, every empire has weak spots, not because the leader is dirty, but because people under him do things he does not see, and Aaliyah has been close enough to learn where to look. Dante said, my team can monitor her communications and movements, but if she tries to leak something to the press, it could move fast. Elijah said, then we move faster. Veronica said, what do you want to do next? Elijah turned back to them, and his eyes were clear, focused, almost calm in a way that was frightening. He said, we end this in 2 more moves. Marcus raised an eyebrow, and he said, 2 moves. Elijah said yes, because she thinks court is where she can survive, and she thinks publicity is where she can scare me, so we will take both away from her. Veronica said, how? Elijah said, first we audit everything, every account she touched, every trust she opened, every executive she influenced, every outside consultant she hired, and we do it publicly enough to reassure investors but privately enough to keep control, and we announce Mercer Holdings is stronger than ever with leadership intact. Marcus nodded, because he understood, stability was a weapon too. Elijah said, second, we give her one last chance to cooperate before the press conference, and if she refuses, then we expose everything ourselves, on our terms, with the footage ready, and we make it impossible for her to spin a story. Veronica said, you want a press conference? Elijah said yes, tomorrow morning, and I want to stand in front of every camera and tell them the truth, not as a victim, but as a warning. Marcus said, and what about her threat? Elijah said if she tries to dig up bodies, she will only prove she was never loyal, and loyalty is the only currency that matters when the world is watching. Dante's phone buzzed again, and he checked it quickly. He said, "Sir, she just entered Pike's office building again, and she is meeting someone else, not Pike, a man who arrived in a separate car." Elijah's eyes narrowed. He said, "Identify him." Dante said, "We are working on it." Elijah nodded, and he said that meeting is the key, because she is not going to court empty-handed, she is going to bring something. Veronica said, "We need to know what she has." Elijah said, "We will know soon, because she is desperate, and desperate people make loud mistakes." He paused, then added, "And we are ending this in part 5, because by then she will either surrender, or she will fall in front of the whole country." Marcus looked at his brother with a mixture of pride and worry. He said, "You sure you ready to watch your marriage die on live television?" Elijah's face tightened for a brief second, and then he released it, because even kings feel pain, they just do not let it steer the throne. Elijah said, "My marriage died the moment she tried to make my signature her weapon. All I am doing now is burying it properly, and making sure the empire does not get buried with it." Then Elijah picked up his shades again and put them on, not to hide, but to control the timing, because the next reveal would be bigger than a boardroom. And as they walked out of that room together, Elijah knew the game had shifted again. Because Aaliyah Mercer was no longer trying to steal quietly. She was preparing to strike loudly. And tomorrow morning, Elijah Mercer was going to speak first, with truth in one hand and evidence in the other, while the whole world watched a blind man's betrayal turn into a billionaire's revenge without a single shot fired. That night the Mercer estate felt too quiet, like the whole mansion was holding its breath, and Elijah Mercer sat alone in his private study staring at the city lights through the glass wall while the security monitors behind him played silent footage of his wife moving through the world like a woman who had already decided her husband was dead. The study smelled like cedar and old leather, the kind of room built for decisions that change bloodlines, and Elijah's fingers rested on the edge of his desk while his mind ran through every possible angle Aaliyah could use to strike back. Because when a person gets exposed, there are only two kinds of reactions, surrender or revenge, and Aaliyah Mercer did not have surrender in her spirit. Dante Cross stood near the door, holding a tablet, his face tight with focus, and Veronica Langley sat on the couch with her laptop open, scrolling through court filing templates like she was sharpening knives. Marcus Mercer paced near the bookshelf, his heavy footsteps making the floor creak, because even though Marcus had seen Elijah survive storms before, he had never seen him fight a storm that lived in his bed. Elijah finally broke the silence and spoke without turning around, and his voice came out low and steady. He said, "What do we have?" Dante stepped forward and held out the tablet, and he said, "We identified the man Aaliyah met at Pike's building. His name is Reggie Cole. He is a crisis PR consultant. He specializes in high-profile divorce scandals and corporate reputation control." Marcus stopped pacing and cursed softly, because that name meant one thing. Aaliyah was not just preparing for court, she was preparing for war in the media. Veronica looked up from her laptop, eyes narrowing, and she said if she hired Reggie Cole, she is planning to control the narrative. She will try to paint herself as the wife who saved the company while you spiraled. Elijah nodded slowly, and he said, "And she will also try to paint me as manipulative for pretending to be blind." Dante said, "Yes sir, and we also pulled her emails. She contacted 2 major media outlets and 1 popular business podcast host. She is preparing a story." Marcus said, "What story?" Dante hesitated, then said, "She is pushing the idea that you staged your blindness to spy on her and trap her, and she is claiming she signed those documents because she was protecting the company from your instability." Veronica let out a quiet breath, because she understood how dangerous that could be. She said the public loves a fallen king story, and they also love a woman who claims she survived a powerful man. She will use the language of victimhood, even though she was the thief. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he did not let anger rise. He simply nodded like a man watching chess pieces move exactly where he expected. He said, "Good." Marcus stared at him, confused, and he said, "Good." Elijah finally turned around, and his eyes were calm, and he said yes, because the moment she goes public, she loses control, and when she loses control, she makes mistakes we can prove. Veronica said we still have to be careful, because if she frames this as emotional abuse, even with evidence, some people will listen, and investors do not like chaos. Elijah walked toward his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a thick folder labeled Mercer Trust Structure. He placed it on the desk like a weapon. He said investors do not like chaos, but they love certainty, and tomorrow morning we give them certainty, we show them the truth, and we show them Mercer Holdings is stable, and we show them I am alive, seeing, and in control. Marcus leaned against the bookshelf, arms crossed, and he said, "What exactly are you going to say tomorrow?" Elijah looked at his brother, and his voice softened just slightly, because Marcus was the only person in the room who could ask him hard questions without fear. Elijah said, "I am going to tell the world that my wife tried to steal from me while pretending to care for me, and I am going to show them the evidence, but I am also going to say something else." Veronica said, "What?" Elijah said, "I am going to say that Mercer Holdings is not a husband and wife brand, it is an institution, and no personal betrayal will shake it, and then I am going to announce leadership restructuring, and I am going to remove everyone who played both sides." Dante nodded, because he knew that would send a message through the entire company like thunder. Marcus said, "And what about Aaliyah, are you going to press charges fully?" Elijah stared at the city lights again, and he said, "I will not decide based on emotion, I will decide based on what protects the empire, because if she goes down criminally, she will fight like an animal, and she will try to burn everything on the way out." Veronica said she already threatened to dig up bodies. Elijah nodded, and he said, "Exactly, so we cut off her access to any bodies she might dig up, and we bury the ones she already found before she can use them." Marcus said, "What does that mean?" Elijah looked at Marcus, and his eyes sharpened. He said, "It means we audit ourselves tonight, not because I am guilty, but because I refuse to be surprised." Veronica nodded, because she respected that kind of discipline. She said, "We can run an internal compliance review immediately, focus on the last 12 months of financial moves, executive approvals, and third-party contracts." Elijah said, "Start with Victor Sloan's department, and start with the CFO's office, and start with anything Aaliyah touched." Dante said, "My team can secure physical files from the executive floor, but if Aaliyah has copies, she could leak them." Elijah said, "She will try." Marcus said, "And if she leaks something real?" Elijah's voice dropped lower, and he said, "Then we face it, because truth does not destroy you, hiding does, and if there is any dirt in my company, I would rather clean it in daylight than let her smear it in darkness." The room went silent again, because Elijah's calm was not just strategy, it was character, and even in betrayal, he was still thinking like a builder. Then Dante's phone buzzed again, and he checked it, then his eyes lifted fast. He said, "Sir, she is at the estate gate." Marcus straightened immediately. Veronica closed her laptop slowly. Elijah did not move, he simply asked, "Is she alone?" Dante said, "No sir, she has Pike with her, and she has a woman with her, looks like a camera crew, small, maybe independent media." Marcus's jaw clenched. He said, "She came here with cameras." Elijah let out a slow breath, and he said, "She is trying to force a scene." Veronica stood up, and she said, "Do you want me to block her legally? We can have security refuse entry, and we can file harassment protections." Elijah shook his head slightly. He said, "No, let her in." Marcus stared at him. Marcus said, "Elijah, you sure?" Elijah said, "Yes, because she wants drama, and I am going to give her something better than drama, I am going to give her the truth on camera, calmly, so she cannot edit me into a monster." Dante nodded and walked out to instruct security. Minutes later, the front door opened, and Aaliyah Mercer walked in like a woman entering her own house, her chin lifted, her eyes sharp, her expression already prepared for the lens. Gerald Pike followed behind her, and beside him stood a woman holding a small camera rig, recording everything like this was a documentary. Aaliyah's voice came out loud, clear, designed for playback. She said, "Elijah, I came to speak to you like adults, because what you did today was cruel and humiliating." Elijah stepped into the foyer, dressed in a dark sweater and tailored pants, his posture calm, his hands relaxed, his face unreadable. He did not wear his cane. He did not wear his shades. He looked like himself. And the moment Aaliyah saw him standing there fully seeing, fully steady, her face flickered with something that looked like fear. But she recovered quickly, turning that fear into anger for the camera. She said, "So you really were lying this whole time, you really did fake being blind?" Elijah's voice stayed calm. He said, "I did not fake being blind, I pretended after my vision returned, because I suspected you were trying to move assets behind my back." Aaliyah scoffed, loud for the camera. She said, "Suspected, you mean you were spying on me, you were manipulating me, you were setting traps?" Elijah nodded slowly. He said, "Yes, I set a trap, because you were stealing." Pike stepped forward smoothly, his voice polished. He said, "Mr. Mercer, this is your wife, and she deserves respect. You are turning a marital disagreement into a public spectacle, and we are here to resolve this." Veronica stepped out from the hallway behind Elijah, her presence instantly shifting the energy, because Veronica looked like law in human form. She said, "Mr. Pike, you are trespassing on private property while recording without consent, and your client is under active investigation, so I suggest you choose your next words carefully." The camera woman hesitated, and Aaliyah snapped at her to keep filming. Aaliyah said, "Keep recording, because the world needs to see what kind of man Elijah Mercer really is." Elijah looked at Aaliyah for a long moment, and his voice came out quieter now, less for the camera and more for her. He said, "Aaliyah, you really came here with cameras to save yourself?" Aaliyah's eyes hardened. She said, "I came here because you embarrassed me, and you think you can destroy me and walk away clean." Elijah said, "I did not embarrass you, I exposed you." Aaliyah stepped closer, and her voice rose. She said, "You exposed me, but you do not understand what you exposed, Elijah. You exposed your own lies too, you exposed that you are capable of deception, and people will question everything about you now." Elijah nodded slowly. He said, "Let them question, I am not afraid of questions, because I have answers." Aaliyah's voice became sharper, and she said, "Then answer this, why did you really pretend to be blind? Was it because you wanted to control me? Was it because you wanted to see what I would do? Was it because you do not trust anyone, because you are paranoid?" Elijah's eyes stayed on hers. He said, "I pretended because the night of the accident, I felt relief in your body when the doctor said I might never see again." The camera caught Aaliyah's face. Her eyes widened slightly. Her lips parted. And for half a second she looked like she had been punched. Elijah continued calmly. He said, "I pretended because I heard you on the phone saying once you got the properties transferred, I would be done, and nobody would question it because everyone thinks I am blind and broken." Aaliyah's breathing changed. She tried to speak, but her voice caught. Elijah said, "I pretended because I needed to know whether the woman I married would protect me, or whether she would harvest me." Pike stepped forward quickly, trying to interrupt. He said, "Mr. Mercer, you are making accusations without context, and you are doing it on camera, this is defamatory." Veronica smiled faintly, and she said, "We have recordings, Mr. Pike, and we have video footage, so please, keep talking, because every time you deny something we can prove, you help us." Aaliyah's face twisted with rage. She said, "You think you are so smart, you think you are a king, but you forget who helped you build this, you forget who stood beside you in those rooms, you forget who defended you when they called you too black, too loud, too ambitious." Elijah's eyes softened slightly, because that part was true, and it hurt that she was using it as a weapon. He said, "I did not forget, Aaliyah, that is why this hurts, because you were my partner, and you chose to become my predator." Aaliyah's voice cracked, and she snapped. She said, "I did what I had to do, because you were slipping, you were losing control, and I was not going to let everything fall apart." Elijah said, "You were not trying to keep it from falling, you were trying to catch it in your hand so you could claim it as yours." Aaliyah shook her head violently. She said, you do not understand what it feels like to be married to a man who owns everything, who controls everything, who makes every decision, who never lets anyone else breathe." Marcus stepped forward, anger in his voice. He said, "You had more than enough air, Aaliyah, you had private jets, estates, power, access, and you still wanted more, you wanted his name without him. Aaliyah turned on Marcus, furious. She said, "Shut up." Elijah lifted his hand slightly, and Marcus stopped. Elijah looked at Aaliyah and spoke slowly. He said, "You wanted more, so tell me the truth, were you working with Victor before the accident?" Aaliyah's eyes flickered toward the camera, then away. She said no. Elijah nodded. He said, "Lie number one." Aaliyah's face tightened. She said, "I am not lying." Elijah said, "We have your messages from before the accident, you and Victor discussing contingency plans, discussing the board, discussing what happens if I become impaired, you were planning before the crash." Aaliyah's mouth opened, then closed again. The camera caught it. The silence caught it. Pike tried to step in again, but Veronica raised her phone calmly. Veronica said, "I advise you not to continue recording, because what you are capturing now is evidence, and it will be used in court, and it will be used in the criminal investigation." Aaliyah snapped. She said, "I do not care, let the world see, because Elijah Mercer is not the hero he pretends to be." Elijah nodded slowly. He said, "Then the world will also see who you are." He turned slightly toward Dante, who had quietly stepped into the foyer with a small tablet. Elijah said, "Dante, play the audio." Dante tapped the screen, and the foyer filled with Aaliyah's own voice from weeks earlier, recorded clearly, cold and laughing. "Once I get the properties transferred, he will be done, and nobody will question it because everyone thinks he is blind and broken." Aaliyah's face went white. Pike's eyes widened. The camera woman's hands trembled slightly, because she realized she was filming a woman being destroyed by her own words. Elijah's voice stayed calm. He said, "You wanted the world to see, Aaliyah, so let them see." Aaliyah's body shook, and she stepped back like she could not breathe. She whispered, "Turn that off." Elijah said no. Then Dante played the next recording. Aaliyah's voice again, sharper this time. "He built all this, but I am the one who deserves to own it." Aaliyah let out a sound that was half sob, half rage. She screamed, "Stop." But the damage was already done. Because the camera was still rolling. And now Aaliyah Mercer was no longer the wife with a sad story. She was the woman caught on audio plotting to rob her blind husband. Elijah stepped closer, and his voice dropped lower. He said, "You came here to force a scene, and you got one, but not the one you wanted." Aaliyah's tears fell fast now. She said, "You hate me." Elijah's face tightened. He said, "I do not hate you, I mourn you, because the woman I loved would never have said those words." Aaliyah wiped her face quickly, trying to recover for the camera, trying to switch back into performance mode. She said, "He is manipulating this, he is editing, he is controlling the narrative." Veronica stepped forward, calm. She said, "There is no editing, Mrs. Mercer, and if you want, we can play the full uncut files in court, under oath, with forensic verification." Aaliyah's eyes darted. She looked trapped. And trapped people do one of two things. They surrender. Or they bite. Aaliyah's face hardened suddenly, and her voice dropped, colder than before. She said, "Fine, you want truth, then I will give you truth." Elijah's eyes narrowed. Aaliyah said the accident was not an accident. The air in the foyer changed instantly. Marcus's eyes widened. Veronica's posture stiffened. Dante's hand moved slightly toward his belt like instinct. Elijah's heart slowed, not sped up, because he had suspected this, but hearing it out loud was like hearing thunder from inside your own house. Elijah spoke quietly. He said, "Say that again." Aaliyah stared at him, tears still on her cheeks, but her eyes now filled with something darker. She said the accident was not an accident, and if you push me, Elijah, I will tell the world exactly what happened on that road. Pike snapped, trying to stop her. He said, "Aaliyah, stop talking." But she was too deep now, too angry, too exposed. Elijah looked at Dante. Elijah said, "Call the investigators, now." Dante nodded and stepped away quickly. Veronica stepped closer to Aaliyah, voice calm but sharp. She said, Mrs. Mercer, are you confessing to attempted murder? Aaliyah's face twisted, and she said, do not call it that, I did not want you dead, I wanted you out. Elijah stared at her, and his voice came out like steel. He said you wanted me out, so you tried to take my eyes. Aaliyah's lips trembled. She said you were never supposed to recover, you were supposed to stay weak, and then you would sign what I needed, and then we would separate quietly, and you would still be rich, and I would finally be free. Marcus stepped forward, shaking with anger. He said you are evil. Aaliyah screamed back. She said I am tired of living in his shadow, I am tired of being his wife and not his equal. Elijah's voice stayed calm, but it carried pain. He said you were my equal until you decided the only way to be equal was to take what I built instead of building your own. Aaliyah's chest heaved. The camera woman whispered to Pike, asking if they should stop filming, but Pike looked terrified now, because his client had just stepped into criminal territory on camera. Elijah looked at Aaliyah and spoke slowly. He said you just ended this yourself. Aaliyah blinked, confused. Elijah said you wanted a divorce war, you wanted a court fight, you wanted a media battle, but now it is not about property, it is about a conspiracy, and you just admitted the accident was planned. Aaliyah's face went pale again. She realized too late. She had bitten. And now the trap had teeth. Dante returned, phone in hand, and he said, Sir, investigators are on the line, they are sending a unit to the estate. Elijah nodded once. Veronica looked at Aaliyah. She said you should stop speaking and you should ask for counsel, because you are burying yourself. Aaliyah's eyes filled with panic. She looked at Elijah like she was suddenly seeing the cliff edge. She whispered, Elijah, please. Elijah's face remained calm, but his voice softened just slightly, not for her sake, but for the sake of the man he used to be. He said, I gave you chances, Aaliyah, and you chose this road every time. Outside, distant sirens began to rise, faint at first, then louder, approaching the estate like judgment. The camera was still recording. Aaliyah's whole plan to control the narrative had collapsed. Because now the narrative was not about a billionaire husband and a greedy wife. It was about a woman who tried to blind a man to steal his empire. And Elijah Mercer stood there, watching the woman he once loved unravel in his foyer, while the sirens came closer. The sirens arrived like the sound of a door finally closing on a life Aaliyah Mercer would never get back, and when the flashing blue lights painted the glass walls of the Mercer estate, Elijah stood in the foyer with his hands calmly behind his back, watching his wife's face shift from rage to disbelief to pure terror. Because in her mind, this was supposed to be a media play, a public sympathy move, a pressure tactic to force Elijah into settlement, but the moment she admitted the accident was not an accident, the whole game changed, and now she was no longer fighting a divorce. She was fighting the law. The front door opened again, and two investigators stepped inside, followed by uniformed officers who moved with the careful alertness of people entering a rich man's home where anything could happen. The lead investigator was a black man in his late 40s named Agent Darnell Hayes, and his eyes were calm but hard, the kind of eyes that had seen too many lies to be impressed by any of them. He looked at Elijah first, respectful, and he said, Mr. Mercer, we received a call regarding a confession. Elijah nodded once. He said you did. Agent Hayes turned his gaze toward Aaliyah, and she immediately tried to straighten her posture like she could still perform her way out of consequences. She said, I did not confess to anything, I was emotional, I was provoked, my husband is manipulating this situation. Hayes did not react. He said, ma'am, were you recorded saying the accident was not an accident? Aaliyah's lips parted. She glanced toward the camera woman, who now looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Aaliyah said, I do not know what you are talking about. Veronica Langley stepped forward smoothly, holding her phone up. She said, Agent Hayes, the recording is unedited, time-stamped, and backed up through the Mercer Estate security system, and we have the audio file already sent to your office. Hayes nodded slowly, then he looked back at Aaliyah. He said, ma'am, you are being asked a direct question. Aaliyah's eyes darted toward Gerald Pike, but Pike's face was pale, and he did not look like a man ready to save her anymore. He looked like a man realizing his career was about to burn with hers. Aaliyah swallowed. She said I was speaking metaphorically. Agent Hayes stared at her. He said metaphorically, you said the accident was not an accident. Aaliyah's voice rose. She said I was angry, I was hurt, he humiliated me, he tricked me, he set me up, he lied about being blind, he is not a victim. Elijah watched her, and what hurt the most was not her denial. It was how fast she turned into someone he did not recognize. Because this was not the Aaliyah who used to sit beside him in empty offices at midnight, helping him review contracts, whispering encouragement, dreaming with him. This was a stranger wearing her face. Agent Hayes nodded slightly, like he had heard enough. He said, Mrs. Mercer, at this moment you are not under arrest, but you are being detained for questioning, and you are advised not to speak further without counsel. Aaliyah's breath caught. She said detained, for what? Hayes said for suspicion of conspiracy related to an incident that caused serious bodily harm. Aaliyah turned toward Elijah, her eyes wide, and for the first time her voice sounded genuinely scared. She said, Elijah, please, do not do this to me. Elijah did not move. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply spoke quietly. He said, I did not do this to you, you did it to yourself. Aaliyah's tears spilled again. She said, I loved you. Elijah's throat tightened for half a second, but he kept his voice steady. He said, you loved what I could give you, and when you thought I was weak, you tried to take everything and leave me in the dark. Agent Hayes gestured, and two officers stepped closer to Aaliyah. Pike immediately raised his hand slightly, trying to regain control. He said, Agent Hayes, I represent Mrs. Mercer, and she will not answer any questions without me present. Hayes nodded. He said, you can accompany her, Mr. Pike, and you may want to consider your own legal counsel as well, because your name has appeared in filings connected to fraudulent transfers. Pike's face tightened. He said, that is ridiculous. Hayes said, maybe, but you will answer questions too. The camera woman lowered her rig, her hands shaking, and she whispered to Aaliyah that they should stop filming. Aaliyah snapped at her, but her voice lacked power now. She said, just stop. The officers escorted Aaliyah toward the door, and as she passed Elijah, she stopped for half a second, her body trembling, her eyes burning with a mix of fear and hatred. She whispered, you will regret this. Elijah leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. He said, I already regretted marrying you, the only thing left now is to correct it. Then she was gone, swallowed by flashing lights and the cold night air. The front door closed again, and the house became quiet in a different way, not tense, but empty, like a room after a storm passes and leaves broken furniture behind. Marcus exhaled hard and ran a hand over his face. He said, Lord have mercy, she just confessed on camera, she really did. Veronica's voice was calm but firm. She said she did not fully confess to planning the crash, but she admitted intent, and intent is enough to open a deeper investigation, and the recording will destroy her credibility in every court, civil and criminal. Dante looked at Elijah. He said, Sir, do you want the camera crew's footage seized? Elijah shook his head. He said, no, let it live, because she came here to weaponize the media, and now the media will weaponize the truth against her. Veronica nodded, because she understood. Aaliyah wanted to control the story, but she just handed Elijah a public sword. That night, Elijah did not sleep. He sat in his study again, but this time the city lights outside looked different, not like victory, not like power, but like distance. Because the empire was still his. But the marriage was ashes. And even though Elijah was a man who could survive anything, he still felt the hollow ache of betrayal in his chest, because money cannot buy back trust once it is dead. At 4 a.m, Veronica returned from her office with printed copies of the emergency injunction filings and a draft press statement. Marcus sat with Elijah at the desk, coffee in hand, watching his brother read in silence. Dante stood near the doorway, receiving updates from his team. Veronica finally spoke. She said, tomorrow morning, you stand in front of cameras, you keep it clean, you keep it calm, you do not sound emotional, you do not insult her, you do not attack her character, you simply present facts and proof, and you remind investors the company is stable. Elijah nodded slowly. He said I will. Marcus leaned in. He said and after that. Elijah stared at the statement, then he said after that, we clean the company, we remove anyone who helped her, we rebuild trust, and we move forward. Marcus said what about her? Elijah paused. He said what about her is in the hands of the law now. The sun rose slowly, turning the sky pale gold. And by 8:30, Mercer Holdings had already set up a press stage in the building lobby. Reporters crowded the area. Cameras pointed forward. Microphones lined up like weapons. The world had heard rumors overnight. Some outlets were saying Aaliyah Mercer was arrested. Some were saying Elijah Mercer faked blindness. Some were saying Mercer Holdings was collapsing. Some were saying it was all a stunt. But nobody had heard from Elijah himself yet. And that silence was killing them. At 9 sharp, the elevator doors opened. Elijah stepped out in a sharp charcoal suit. No cane. No shades. His eyes visible. Clear. Steady. Alive. Marcus walked beside him. Veronica walked behind him. Dante and security flanked them like a wall. The reporters erupted immediately, shouting questions. Mr. Mercer, were you really blind? Mr. Mercer, did your wife try to steal your property? Mr. Mercer, was the accident staged? Mr. Mercer, is Mercer Holdings safe? Elijah stepped up to the podium and raised one hand slightly, and the room quieted like the ocean obeying the moon. He looked into the cameras, and his voice came out calm, deep, and controlled. He said good morning. He paused, letting the moment settle. He said my name is Elijah Mercer, and I am the founder and CEO of Mercer Holdings. He looked straight ahead. He said 3 months ago, I was involved in an accident that caused temporary vision loss, and during my recovery, I discovered unauthorized attempts to transfer Mercer assets through deception and fraud. He did not mention Aaliyah's name yet. He did not need to. The world already knew. He continued. He said I want to be clear, Mercer Holdings remains stable, our operations are secure, our investors will receive a detailed report today, and our leadership remains intact. Then he leaned slightly closer to the microphone. He said however, I will not allow anyone, including anyone close to me, to steal what thousands of employees have helped build. The reporters leaned forward. Elijah said yesterday, fraudulent transfer documents were filed using my signature obtained under false pretenses, and those filings have been frozen through emergency injunction. Veronica stepped forward slightly and handed him a small folder. Elijah lifted a single page and held it up for cameras. He said this is one of the documents, and this is the signature line, and this is the property description. He lowered it. He said and we have video evidence of how the signature was obtained, and we have recordings that demonstrate intent. The crowd murmured. Elijah finally said her name. He said my wife, Aaliyah Mercer, is currently under investigation, and I will not comment further on criminal proceedings. The room erupted again. Elijah lifted his hand again, calm. He said I will say this, betrayal does not destroy an empire, secrecy does, and I refuse to let secrecy live inside my company or my home. He paused. Then he delivered the line that made every executive watching from their offices feel their stomach drop. He said effective immediately, Mercer Holdings is initiating a full internal audit of all executive actions taken during my recovery, and any individual found to have assisted in unauthorized transfers will be removed and held accountable. The reporters scribbled. The cameras zoomed in. Elijah continued. He said I built this company as a symbol of black excellence, not as a personal bank account for anyone who thinks marriage is a shortcut to ownership. That sentence hit like thunder. Because it was not just about Aaliyah anymore. It was about every person watching who had ever thought proximity to power meant entitlement to it. Elijah took a breath. Then he said lastly, I want to speak directly to my employees and investors. if you believed rumors that I was weak, if you believed Mercer Holdings was vulnerable, understand this clearly. He looked into the lens like he was staring into the soul of the country. He said, I can see. And I have been watching. The lobby fell silent for a moment, because the way he said it was not just literal, it was spiritual, it was a warning, it was a promise. Then he stepped back from the podium. Veronica moved forward to handle legal questions. Marcus guided Elijah toward the elevator. And as they walked away, Elijah did not feel joy. He felt finality. Because the story had ended where it needed to end. A billionaire pretended to be blind. A wife tried to steal his empire with papers and lies. And the moment she thought she had won, she confessed to something darker than greed. Now the law would handle her. The company would be cleaned. And Elijah Mercer would rebuild what betrayal tried to break. Not by pretending to be blind anymore. But by making sure everyone around him understood one truth they would never forget. A man does not become Elijah Mercer by being easy to defeat. He becomes Elijah Mercer by seeing everything coming. Even the knife held by the person sleeping beside him.